December 1940, northern France. The crisp, biting air was filled with the sound of artillery and the relentless roar of German tanks as the Wehrmacht retreated from the French countryside. Kurt Müller, a 22-year-old soldier from Bavaria, had been part of the German army's rapid advance through Western Europe. His division, part of Operation Fall Gelb, had swept through France, but now, after months of fierce fighting, they were in full retreat, harried by British forces and the French resistance. The tension in the air was palpable as German soldiers scrambled to escape the tightening Allied noose. Kurt had fought across France, from the early days of the invasion to the battles on the Somme. Now, as the Allied forces surged forward, his unit found itself surrounded. The retreat was chaotic, filled with the deafening sounds of shells exploding around them. The orders of commanding officers shouted through the confusion and the constant threat of being overrun. Kurt's thoughts raced as he scanned the foggy horizon, realizing his chances of survival were dwindling with every minute. The realization hit hard. The German military had underestimated the British, and now they were paying the price. When Kurt and his unit were finally captured near the town of Dunkirk, it was nothing like the Hollywood portrayals of dramatic standoffs. There were no grand battles, no heroic last stands, just confusion, disarray, and the overwhelming sense of defeat. Kurt, along with a dozen of his comrades, was rounded up by British soldiers and marched toward the docks, where they were herded onto British ships in silence, save for the occasional murmur between soldiers. There was no gunfire, no hostile interrogation. The British soldiers, surprisingly, didn't shout or push the men around. Instead, they were simply escorted onto the ships, their hands bound loosely behind their backs. Kurt glanced around, feeling a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had been trained to expect nothing less than brutality from the enemy, but the reality was far different. As the boat made its way across the English Channel to the British Isles, Kurt sat quietly among the other prisoners, listening to the soft murmur of the sea against the hull. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion. What had he expected? Torture? Starvation? Maybe even execution for the atrocities they had committed in France? The rumors he had heard about the British were far from kind. The Third Reich's propaganda machine had painted the British as weak, cowardly, and unworthy of respect. They were supposed to be easy prey, but instead, they had trapped his men. Upon landing in southern England, the prisoners were led to an encampment just outside the small village of Chichester. The journey had taken only hours, but the overwhelming feeling of dread that had built up within Kurt seemed to stretch far longer. They were marched from the docks to the camp, their footsteps heavy in the mud. As they approached the gates, the sight before them seemed almost unreal. There were no armed guards waiting to yell at them, no harsh punishments for the slightest mistake. In fact, there were no harsh sounds at all. The camp was quiet, almost serene, with neatly arranged barracks and well-kept gardens. Kurt's mind raced. This wasn't what he had imagined. He had expected chaos, suffering, and brutality, not this strangely orderly place. They were directed toward an area near the camp's edge, where they were given clear instructions to stand in line and wait. There was no forceful demand to move quickly, no whips or harsh hands. The British soldiers simply looked at them, their expressions neutral, as though this were a routine exercise. "Come on, lads, move along," one of the British guards said, motioning for the prisoners to follow him. His tone was calm, almost detached. Inside the camp, the German prisoner of wars were quickly assigned to different barracks. Kurt walked through the rows of buildings, his eyes scanning the camp. The barracks were basic but well-maintained. Each prisoner was given a cot, a blanket, and a small wooden desk to store their belongings. The floors were swept clean, and the walls were freshly painted, a far cry from the squalid conditions they had feared. There was no sense of overcrowding, no stench of filth in the air. It almost felt like a college dormitory, except the occupants were soldiers, prisoners of war. Kurt sat on the edge of his cot, running his fingers through his short, disheveled hair. He couldn't shake the feeling of disorientation. This wasn't the prison he had imagined. He had been trained to expect horrible conditions, forced to work 12-hour shifts with little food, and to live in fear of the enemy guards. Yet here, they were treated like men, not beasts. The evening meal brought even more confusion. The guards served soup, bread, and even a portion of cooked meat, something that was far better than the rations they had lived on in Germany, and a stark contrast to the scarcity they had anticipated. "What is this?" Kurt asked, his voice incredulous. He looked around at the other prisoners, who were equally silent. "This can't be real. Just eat it," one of the older German prisoner of wars muttered, his voice resigned. "You'll see. They feed us well here, but we're still prisoners." For Kurt, the reality of being a German prisoner of wars began to set in. There were still rules to follow, still the knowledge that he was on enemy soil, but there was a comfort in this strange new world. It was a world he hadn't expected, one that seemed almost unreal. How could these men, who he had been told to hate, be treating him with such decency? The food wasn't just filling. It was sustaining, something the soldiers hadn't expected to experience on the other side of captivity. The bread was fresh, the soup hot, the meat tender. It was humane, the opposite of the starvation and brutality they had been led to believe was their fate. As the men ate, Kurt's mind raced. The contradictions seemed to swirl around him. The British were supposed to be cruel, untrustworthy, and weak. They were the enemy, and yet they were treating him with a humanity he had never anticipated. The night was spent in uneasy silence as the German prisoner of wars lay in their cots, reflecting on what they had just experienced. The camp's quiet was broken only by the occasional murmur of men turning in their beds, still struggling to adjust to their new reality. Kurt closed his eyes, trying to silence the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. Everything he had believed about the British was being turned upside down. The war wasn't just about the enemy across the lines. It was about the truth of what they were fighting for. But Kurt wasn't sure what that truth was anymore. The British weren't the monsters he had been taught to fear. They weren't the enemy he had imagined. They were simply men, doing what they had been trained to do, uphold the rules of war. And now, as a prisoner, Kurt Muller began to realize that the line between enemy and captor was far more complicated than he had ever been told. The days that followed felt like a strange blur to Kurt Muller and his fellow German prisoner of wars, as they tried to adjust to their new life. The early confusion gave way to a dawning realization. This was not the captivity they had been prepared for. The British camp was more like a well-organized community than a harsh prison. The more Kurt settled into the routine, the more the dissonance between what he had been told about the enemy and the reality of their treatment continued to eat away at him. Each morning, they were woken by the sound of the camp bell, signaling the start of the day. The British guards moved through the barracks, their boots tapping against the wooden floors as they checked on the prisoners. There were no loud commands, no whips cracking over their heads. Instead, the guards simply made their rounds, ensuring the prisoners were getting up and getting ready for their assigned tasks. The first real shock came during the first meal in the camp. Kurt had expected gruel, maybe some stale bread and water, but what they were given was far from that. The British served a hearty stew with chunks of beef, potatoes, and vegetables. There was bread on the side, fresh and soft, and even a small portion of butter, a luxury Kurt had never imagined he'd see in British captivity. For a moment, he thought it was some sort of trick. "I don't trust this," Kurt whispered to Ernst, who sat next to him. "It's too good to be true." Ernst, who had been a soldier on the Eastern Front before his capture, looked around at the other men. They were eating, yes, but they were eating in stunned silence, unsure how to react. For a moment, it felt wrong, like they were in the midst of some strange dream, but the rumbling in their stomachs told them the truth. "I don't know," Ernst replied, shaking his head. "But it's real. The meal wasn't perfect. There was no luxury or fancy seasonings, but it was filling and satisfying." Kurt couldn't help but notice how well-fed the other German prisoner of wars seemed to be. Even the older men, who had been through more than their fair share of battles, seemed to have some color return to their faces. The next meal, breakfast, was just as surprising. They were given porridge, made from oats, and it was served with sugar and milk. The German prisoner of wars were even allowed to add jam to the porridge if they wanted. For Kurt, it was a strange experience. He had always thought that food in a German prisoner of war's camp would be scarce, that they would be given nothing but scraps. Yet here they were, being treated to what seemed like a home-cooked breakfast. The work they were assigned to was equally unexpected. Kurt had been prepared for hard labor, digging trenches, carrying heavy loads, perhaps even being forced to repair the infrastructure of the camp under brutal supervision. But the reality was something quite different. Instead of digging or hauling, they were given tasks that required far less physical exertion: gardening, painting the barracks, maintaining the camp's facilities. The work was light but steady, and there was little pressure to rush. At the end of each day, they were given time to rest, read, or even exercise in the open yard. One of the first things Kurt noticed was that the British authorities didn't push them to work beyond their means. There were no long hours of forced labor, no demands to overexert themselves. If anything, the pace was much slower than he had expected. Kurt and the other soldiers were required to maintain the camp, but it didn't feel like forced labor. It felt more like ordinary work, something people would do if they were living in any regular town or village. The work was not physically demanding, and it was manageable. "This is easier than I thought," Kurt said, wiping his brow after finishing a task in the camp garden. "We're not working the way we were told we would." "Yeah," Ernst said, shaking his head. "This is too easy. I keep waiting for the catch." But there was no catch. There were no whips, no endless hours of grueling work. The British treated them as men, not slaves, and the tasks they were given felt almost trivial, but still meaningful. They were doing work for the camp, something that felt normal, not like punishment. Then came pay. Kurt was told that they would receive a small allowance for the work they did, a kind of token payment that, for the most part, went towards purchasing goods from the camp store, mostly toiletries, snacks, and small luxuries like chocolate or tobacco. It wasn't much, but it was more than Kurt had ever expected. To him, it felt almost like they were being treated as normal civilians, working for their basic needs, not prisoners being exploited for their labor. "I can't believe it," Kurt said one evening as he stood in line to receive his weekly pay. "They're paying us like we're workers." Ernst nodded, his face tight with confusion. "They're paying us. We're German prisoner of wars, and they're paying us. It doesn't make sense." As the days turned into weeks, Kurt's initial skepticism began to shift. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful or deeply suspicious. There were still moments when he felt the weight of captivity, the realization that he was on enemy soil, that he was still a prisoner. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. One day, Kurt was walking toward the mess hall when he passed by a British soldier who nodded at him. Kurt couldn't help but notice how calm the soldier was, how his expression held no malice, no anger. The soldier was just doing his job, and that was all. As Kurt walked into the mess hall, he glanced back at the soldier, his mind swirling with confusion. These men, the enemy, were treating him with a level of respect and decency that Kurt had never imagined. In the middle of the war, amidst the chaos of everything, these men were monsters. They weren't villains. They were soldiers. It was a realization that Kurt Muller would struggle with for the duration of the war. The British soldier, the one who had looked at him with a small nod, wasn't the enemy. Neither were the guards who oversaw the German prisoner of wars. They were simply doing their job, just as he had been doing his before he was captured. And that understanding, the simple human truth that connected them all, began to gnaw at him, slowly unraveling the hardened ideologies he had spent so long believing in. The days in the British prisoner of war camp unfolded with a steady, almost monotonous routine. Kurt Muller had settled into a strange rhythm, the early disbelief fading into a reluctant acceptance of his new life. The food, the work, and the camp's conditions were far better than he had ever imagined. But it was the way the British guards interacted with the prisoner of wars that continued to unsettle him. The guards, unlike the brutal overseers Kurt had expected, were calm, professional, and, most surprising of all, courteous. They weren't the cold, indifferent figures he had been led to believe they would be. Instead, they seemed like men who were simply doing a job, nothing more, nothing less. The guards would come around during the day to check on the prisoners, making sure everyone was at their assigned workstations and that the tasks were being completed. They were never harsh, never demanding. Instead, they would walk along the lines of prisoner of wars, occasionally making brief, polite comments. One afternoon, as Kurt worked in the camp garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables, a British guard approached him. Kurt glanced up, momentarily stopping his task. The guard was a tall man with a weathered face and a soft voice, far from the menacing figures Kurt had expected. He stopped in front of Kurt, looking at the patch of garden they had been tending. "You're doing a good job here," the guard said, offering a small smile. "It's good to see the place looking tidy." Kurt wasn't sure how to respond. He had expected this guard to bark at him, to remind him of his status as a prisoner. Instead, he was being acknowledged for his work. For the first time, he was treated as more than just a captured enemy. He was being seen for the simple act of doing his assigned task. "Thank you," Kurt said, his voice uncertain. The guard gave a nod, then walked away, leaving Kurt standing there, a mix of confusion and discomfort settling in his chest. He treated me like I wasn't a prisoner, Kurt thought to himself. Like I was just a worker. It was moments like this that continued to chip away at the mental walls he had built. Every day, as he interacted with the British guards, his perception of them continued to evolve. They weren't faceless enemies. They were men, doing their duty. And there was a humanity in their actions that felt almost unnatural to Kurt, who had been raised to see them as nothing more than targets. As time passed, the initial unease gave way to a deeper understanding, one that Kurt couldn't quite explain. The guards, though strict in their duties, never treated the prisoner of wars with the brutality Kurt had expected. The punishments were minimal, usually for disobedience or attempts to escape. The British seemed far more concerned with keeping the camp organized and efficient, as though the war had no place in the everyday routines of camp life. And in this strange environment, where human decency was so unexpectedly prevalent, Kurt began to feel a growing discomfort, a sense of guilt for questioning the guards' actions. He had been trained to view them as monsters, yet they had shown him nothing but professionalism and, times, even kindness. The guards even took moments to speak to the prisoners on a personal level, something Kurt never thought possible. One afternoon, a British officer approached the men while they were working near a small wooden shed at the edge of the camp. The officer, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, asked them how they were feeling and whether they were comfortable in the camp. "Is there anything you need?" the officer asked, his tone matter-of-fact but kind. At first, Kurt hesitated, unsure how to answer. They were prisoners, after all. Shouldn't they be treated harshly? Instead, they were being spoken to like humans, as if they were not just soldiers of war, but individuals with needs. One of the older men in the group spoke up. "We're fine, sir," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "The conditions are better than we expected." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to hear," he said. "We want to make sure you're treated fairly. After all, we're all just doing our jobs, aren't we?" Kurt stared at the officer as he walked away. The words stuck in his mind. The officer had called them all just doing our jobs. The enemy wasn't so different after all, and in the quiet moments, Kurt began to understand the cost of that realization. Weeks turned into months, and the prisoner of wars became more accustomed to their new life. It was not the hell they had imagined. The British didn't treat them like animals, as Nazi propaganda had claimed. They were given decent food, warm clothing, and, most surprisingly, they were respected. There were no brutal interrogations, no constant threats of death or mistreatment. Even the most hardened soldiers began to soften, and the camp slowly took on the air of normalcy. However, the war was never far from their minds. Each day, the prisoner of wars were aware of the larger world outside, the fighting that continued across Europe, the battles that raged on in Africa and the East. But inside the camp, it felt like a strange, isolated world. The British guards, though still the enemy, became almost familiar. Their daily interactions with the prisoners, a reminder that war was a human affair, full of complexities and shades of gray. Kurt, more than anyone, struggled with this new reality. He'd been raised on the certainty that German superiority was absolute, that the enemy was always inferior. Yet the men who guarded him showed no signs of weakness, no sign that they believed in the same ideals that he had been taught to uphold. They were professional, yes, but they were also human. As the war continued to rage on, and the Allied forces began to push back against the Axis, Kurt Muller's time in British captivity dragged on. He had been a prisoner for months, and in that time, the world had changed. The German army had begun to falter on several fronts, and the tide of the war had started to turn. But inside the camp, Kurt could only focus on the present, the meals, the tasks, the humanity that had been shown to him by his captors. And when the war finally came to an end, Kurt was released along with thousands of other prisoner of wars. The return home was surreal. After months of living in a strange, suspended reality, the world outside felt unfamiliar. The countryside seemed smaller, quieter. Kurt had to readjust to life, to find his place in a world that had been so profoundly changed. But in the quiet moments, when he reflected on his time in Britain, he found himself thinking not of the war, but of the men who had captured him, the British guards who had treated him with respect when he expected cruelty. The experience had altered something within him. The war was not just a conflict between nations. It was a battle between humans, all of whom were capable of good and evil, of sacrifice and suffering. And so, as Kurt Muller returned to a war-torn Germany, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to be a soldier, a prisoner, and a human being. His view of the enemy had been forever changed, and in that change, he found something both profound and unsettling. The realization that no one was truly evil, but that everyone was shaped by the same brutal forces of war.